screen.
Like a Where's Waldo exercise for all of
Where's
you.
Waldo? Oh man, I really missed an opportunity. I have a red and white striped shirt. Oh well, it's time. I'm going to go ahead and share screen here so that you all can see the PowerPoint. And just to give you an idea of what we're going to be doing today, we're going to be doing some upfront kind of conceptual framing of the ideas, of probably more talking at you upfront than we would do in a in-person session, but we are going to be turning it over to you for an opportunity to do some back and forth with one another in some breakout room conversations. And then, as is typical of these things, we'll be bringing you back for a group conversation at the end. So without further ado, here's the agenda for today. For starters, we're going to get to kind of straight at the basic question, which a lot of folks are asking, which is a time like now any time to do strategy, to do any kind of thinking about the future, or do you have to wait until the fog is clearing, or to use Jeff Poulos's mom, until the fog burns off? We'll do a little bit of a framing of the way we think about strategy. Strategy is, I think, one of the most overused words in the English language, but greatly misunderstood. So we're going to tell you what we mean when we talk about strategy. And then we're going to tie it into what we think is, as you're doing strategy, probably the biggest concern that's on your minds, which is thinking about sustainability strategy. How do you come at that? How do you think about that? And from there, we're going to get much more concrete about what you would actually do to get started on this. And then finally, having this interactive discussion. So with that said, we will dive right into it with the starting point: why strategy now? So, first off, I think it's fair to say that all of us have gone through some version of this sequence. It's probably a little less linear than this, but it's some combination of panic, consideration of ways to pivot, and then trying to get out of panic and kind of immediate response, crisis response, pivoting into more planning mode, thinking about, of the things that we're pivoting, which things are temporary fixes, which things might actually mean structural changes in the way we do business and the way we serve our communities, et cetera. I guess the thing that I would say upfront about this is that strategy has always been done in uncertainty. The only difference in today's moment is there's like 10x the uncertainty that there typically is. But whenever we finish a strategic planning process with a client, the core of it is trying to understand what are the unknowns, what are the knowns, and what are you going to be doing over the course of implementing the strategy that can help make some of those unknowns a little more knowable, if that makes sense. I don't think that discipline has changed. I don't think that framework has changed, particularly in the current moment. One thing I'd like you to do right now, just a little exercise. If you have a pen and paper, that's great. You can jot it down on your computer, wherever. I'd like you to think of a pivot that you have to make, or that you have had to make, about the way your organization serves its community, the way your finances are structured, any kind of crisis response changes that you've had to make over the past year. Think of at least one, and we're going to be coming back to that in the breakout discussion. So I'd just like you to jot that down. Think of it. You've obviously got some time to perseverate on it over the course of the next hour before we do that breakout. So that'll be fun for you as well. So I don't know how many of you are engineers in your past lives or spare time, but there's a concept that's actually a big part of the internet as well, at least the early days of the internet, which is called signal to noise ratio, the ratio of relevant to irrelevant information in an interface or communication channel. And really what you're trying to get to is the signal. You want to cut out the noise and get to the signal. And really, at its heart, that's what we think of when we think of strategy. That strategy is the art of cutting through the noise to focus on the signal, which are your long-term priorities. Another way to think of it is strategy as a map. And you can see in the diagram up top, this simple notion of you start, you have a plan, and you finish. And then, for most of us, the reality is you start, you double back, you take a detour, you come back up, you actually reframe what it is, and eventually you get to the finish line. And so I think that's part of what you need to understand about this. Again, going back to what I said about the fundamental role of uncertainty in strategy, that actually the purpose of strategy is to navigate uncertainty. If you leave our session today with nothing else, that's the message I want you to come away with. Another thing to talk about here, I'll occasionally use the phrase strategic plan just because it's something that people commonly talk about. So there's a point of reference to it, but actually we don't like that combination of words. We think that there is a strategy, which is why you do what you do and how you do what you do. And then there's the plan, which is the what you do. So if you think about it, a lot of the work of doing this is framing what your long-term vision is, what the impact is that you'd like to have, your hypothesis about what's kind of within bounds and outside of bounds of the things that you would do as an organization. That is the kind of key questions around strategy. And that takes you to, what are you going to do? Ideally, the strategy should be fairly constant over the course of a 3 or 5 year period that you're doing this. The plan, on the other hand, if you're doing this right, should not be that constant. Because honestly, if you are doing exactly what you predicted you would be doing 3 years from now, either you're some sort of genius and I want to, talk to you about the stock market, or more likely you're not thinking dynamically, you're not taking risks, you're not actually taking in information in the environment and putting that to use. And adapting your strategy and your plan as you go along. All right, so that's kind of a quick primer on strategy. And from there, we want to talk about the kind of the elephant in the room to some degree around strategy right now, which is, how can you think about strategy when you're worrying about whether you can survive? And there's both short-term survival questions, but there's also long-term survival questions about sustainability. Some of you have had a chance to see the blog post that we just put out on 5 myths, 5 truths about sustainability. I'm going to quickly walk through the key concepts there, and then we're going to take a little poll about this. So, I had a title back when I started in consulting about 10 years ago at Root Cause, after having been a nonprofit executive director for several go-rounds. My title was Director of Financial Sustainability. And it was a great title because it both was an internally facing role. I was worried about Root Cause's financial sustainability, but it was also externally facing. We were trying to build a practice helping people think about financial sustainability. And one of the things that I discovered, I went out and interviewed about 40 foundation leaders around the country and an equal number of nonprofit leaders. And I discovered a few things. First of all, nobody actually knew what they meant by the phrase financial sustainability. They had a variety of working definitions in their mind, some of which were accurate, most of which, frankly, were off base in our view. But it was also one of those things where nobody could define it, but everybody was in favor of it. And so what we want to do is talk about what are the key myths that we've run into, both in the course of our consulting practice, but also going back to being a nonprofit CEO myself, about financial sustainability and what are the truths that have emerged around that. So the first myth is conflating stability with sustainability. I, have talked to organizations that have said, we're sustainable. We have positive cash flow every year. We're doing fine. And yet, if you dig in underneath that, you realize that there's, a big 3-year term limited grant that is keeping them in positive cash flow. And the organization does not have a strategy or even a hypothesis about how they're going to replace that capital. They're waiting for that runway to run out before they figure out the next thing. That's not sustainability. That is stability, which is certainly preferable to instability, but it's not sustainability. The truth is that you have to distinguish between what we would call one-time versus repeatable sources of funds. One-time funds are typically foundation grants. There are some exceptions to this. There are foundations that are going to stick with a grantee for an extended period of time and might be considered more sustainable than unsustainable, but that tends to be the exception rather than the rule. I think most of us are much more familiar with experiences with funders who give us a grant for a few years and then we cycle out, and maybe they'll come back to us later, maybe they won't. And when I'm talking about foundations, by the way, I should be clear that I'm talking about institutional funders. I'm not talking about family foundations. Family foundations, in our mind, are really just a vehicle for high net worth individuals to spend their money. And so we treat them as individual donors for the most part, except if it's actually a large staffed institutional family foundation, like say the Smith Family Foundation here in the Boston area. It is technically a family foundation, but it essentially runs like an institutional foundation. Myth number 2, diversify. Yeah, I'm going to be arguing against diversification. You heard it here first. And what I mean by that is horizontal diversification versus vertical diversification. What we mean by horizontal diversification are the different types of revenue that you're trying to take in and manage. So let's say that you've got foundation grants, you've got relatively small individual donors, and that's largely your revenue mix. And you have a board member.
Can you turn on the tea kettle?
Yes, I can.
Oh.
Once I'm done with this presentation, I will turn on the tea kettle. All right. Don't you guys just love this though? It is the best. And I'm sorry we don't even know who it was that said that. So if you're feeling embarrassed, don't worry. We don't know who you were, but you gave us some comic relief. So thank you for that. All right. So what we mean by horizontal diversification is trying to bring in too many different kinds of revenue at the same time. So bringing in foundation money, government money, small donors, large donors, earned revenue. Each of those types of revenue streams requires different kinds of skill sets and specializations to be able to do well with it. If any of you have ever gotten government grants, you know that that is like its own rabbit hole right there, just understanding how to write a government grant or how to negotiate a government contract. That can be something that takes up a couple people's time on your staff just to be able to do that. So if you're a relatively small nonprofit, talking about horizontal diversification, talking about specializing across 3, 4 different kinds of revenue streams is really unsustainable. Because first of all, you're not going to be able to afford to hire people to be good at all 4 of those revenue streams. So chances are you're going to do all 4 of those revenue streams poorly rather than picking 1 or 2 revenue streams and doing really well with them. The trick is obviously to find the right revenue streams to get really good at, but definitely don't try to be good at 4 or 5 different types of revenue at once, unless you're a really big, and I mean like hundreds of millions of dollars big type of nonprofit. So the truth, diversify vertically. And what we mean by this is what we worry about when we see that an organization, say an organization is getting a lot of foundation grants. In and of itself, sure, there's a worry about that because foundation grants come and go. But if we look at, we have some clients where they have 30 different foundations that are supporting them, some big, some small, from around the country, that sort of thing. And so I worry less about their exposure because while one individual foundation is going to come and go on a year over year, they've demonstrated that they know how to work the foundation market and how to bring in that revenue. And so unless the trend line for that foundation support is starting to dramatically go down over time, I feel relatively okay about them. So what we tend to look at is within any one of those specific verticals, if it's government, is there one government contract that represents more than 20% of the organization's budget? Is there one foundation that represents more than 20% of the foundation's budget? Is there one high net worth donor who represents more than 20% of your budget? If any of the answers to that is yes, you definitely need to worry about diversifying more, but diversifying within that vertical that you're already good at, not trying to take on a new vertical like starting a taco truck business or something like that. And that gets us actually to taco trucks, silver bullet revenue. So I think one of the things that we've seen over time have been organizations, and often this comes from well-meaning board members on organizations, you know, hearing about some group that raised a bunch of money on a bike ride or a bunch of money on starting a breakfast muffin business, or, you know, whatever it is. Why can't we do that thing? Because if we could just make money doing that, which is the thing that that board member is familiar with, the idea of running a small business and making money doing it, then we won't have to worry so much about having to raise money each year. Don't get us wrong. There are circumstances where pursuing earned revenue businesses, social enterprises, is a really good idea for nonprofits. We have clients who are doing it and are quite successful at it. But I can tell you that in those situations, number one, that client clearly already has that expertise in what it takes to succeed running that kind of business. It's highly connected to their mission. It's not a diversion from the delivery of their mission. It actually reinforces their mission. And most importantly, there's a market for whatever it is that they want to do. And there's not a lot of competition already existing in that market for whatever the thing is that the client wants to do. Those are the circumstances where that works. But just like saying automatically a walkathon, a taco truck is going to be the answer to all of our sustainability prayers, chances are that's not going to work. And that gets to the truth, which is time and patience generally are the way that you're going to build a sustainable revenue model, not through quick fixes. The next is building your revenue goal around your impact goal. So what we mean by that is saying, you know, we've seen strategic plans written by folks, not us, that will say something like, we plan to go from serving 10,000 students every year to serving 100,000 students in 5 years. And so therefore, our revenue plan is whatever it's going to require us to get from those 10,000 students to those 100,000 students. That's our revenue plan. It's basically the revenue target is whatever that impact goal is. And maybe it's a hairy, audacious goal, we don't know. The problem with that is it doesn't tell us anything about where's the evidence that there are actually enough funds in the market to pursue that 100,000 student goal. Often, you know, there may be a very compelling need to serve those 100,000 students. So don't get us wrong. The desire to serve more clients is totally the right instinct in our field. The question is, where's the money going to come from to do it, and where's the evidence of that? Which gets to this truth, which is the market drives revenue. And by market, we don't mean the stock market or, you know, some kind of framework like that. What we mean by that is, again, for example, if you're saying that to get to whatever funding level you need to get to serve 100,000 kids, you need to raise $5 million from high net worth individuals. I want to know a few things. What's the geography that you're trying to reach those 5 million donors in? How many people are there in that geography that actually would be classified as high net worth individuals? Of those high net worth individuals, how many of them give to charity? Of those who give to charity, how many give to your social issue? And then of those who give to your social issue, I want to know how many other competitors are there in that geography who are also claiming to address that social issue. So therefore, they're competing with you for that high net worth donor's attention. That's a market framework for understanding what the possible revenue is in a given area. And that will determine your revenue goal, not the number of people that you aspire to serve. Another similar frame is that your revenue goal is driven by the cost of your program. So if it costs you $100,000 a year to deliver a program, your revenue goal is $100,000. And the problem with this is that it leaves out all of the indirect costs of running that program. It leaves out the cost of administration, the cost of fundraising to get to serve to that $100,000. Everything else that goes into running your organization is left out of that, and you haven't covered that with your revenue goal. And so that gets us to this notion of fully loaded costs, that for any particular program, you have to be allocating your indirect costs. We're not talking here about the way that an accounting firm may be thinking about cost allocation in your audit or something like that. We're just talking about, for you, understanding in simple terms, what does it really cost me to run a program? And so let's say, for the sake of argument, that you have 3 different types of programs that you're running, and each program is, let's say, 1/3 of the total costs of the budget. Then what I would do is add up all my administration and fundraising expenses and divide them by 1/3 and allocate 1/3 of it to each of them. And so the notion is, then you've got a rough idea of what's the fully loaded cost of program A versus program B versus program C. Finally, very important, test, fail fast, repeat. With any kind of approach to sustainability, you are going to have a hypothesis about how this is going to work, a hypothesis about where the donors are, where the revenue is. I think you need to test that hypothesis, recognize that some of those tests are going to fail, and you're either then going to have to reframe the hypothesis or abandon it. One of the things that I've seen, we had one client in another state that was convinced that they had an earned revenue strategy that was going to work for them. When we came in and worked with them, unfortunately, it became very clear that that strategy was not going to work. We talked to the potential customers that they thought they could sell it to, and the customers were at best lukewarm on what it was that they wanted to do, and they had other solutions that were available to them. We came back to them and said, there's just not a lot of opportunity here. The organization stuck with it, and unfortunately, it nearly dragged them under as an organization. And the lesson there was, don't throw good money after bad. Don't, if you're pursuing a particular line and the evidence is not coming back in the way you expected, at a certain point, you need to cut your losses. Even if you've spent a ton of money and you had high hopes and emotionally you don't want to let go of it, the really important thing is to have that test, fail fast, repeat idea. Okay, I've been doing a lot of talking here, and what I'd like to do quickly now is a quick poll with you all. where you get to weigh in on whether you have experienced any of these myths and whether you're pursuing any of these truths. We just want to take a quick temperature check on all of you. So I'm launching the poll, and you should see this come up, I hope, on your screens. All right, well, that is excellent. I think on the first one, I think what we're seeing is the horizontal versus vertical is the kind of leading myth, not a surprise, and the stability, sustainability conflation kind of right behind it. And building revenue around direct versus indirect costs is also there. So those are your kind of top three on the truths. Really glad to see that the pursuit, taking time and patience on this and understanding fully loaded costs, distinguishing one-time versus repeatable revenue are definitely the truths that you guys are pursuing. All right, so we're moving, I'm gonna move quickly through this because I'm realizing that we've got some other stuff to do here. So I want to make sure that we get that. We'll get the poll out to you at the end of this, I think. So I'm going to quickly then, just because we've talked a bit about the sustainability, the approach to sustainability, Amanda, I think I'm going to actually jump through the next few slides a little bit because I think we can kind of move past that quickly. But what I would say is this, a few things. First,
Do you want to, sorry, just really quickly, there's a good question in the chat. If you want to just take like 30 seconds to respond to that, I think it's a really good point in the reality of drafting your revenue strategy.
Yeah. Do you want to share what the question is, just so I don't have to dig through for it?
Sure. So Rudy says that conceptually, market driving revenue is an ideal approach, but that also leveraging impact goals to market and create urgency to drive fundraising can create a bigger market. The idea of success breeding success. And I think just an initial response is that that's certainly ideal if you are able to have raised funds initially to get to some sort of impact goals to then demonstrate that your strategy, your program strategy has been successful in some ways. Certainly that could generate excitement. But that, when you're looking at the initial approach, if you're creating a new program or looking for an initial kind of proof of concept, certainly that might be a bit more difficult to approach in that way. But being able to generate excitement and drive for fundraising is, of course, everyone's ideal situation for as you're fundraising for a program.
Yep. No, I agree completely. And Amanda has heard me use this analogy before, but I call it the Starbucks principle. And by that, what I mean is some of us on this call are old enough to remember a time when Starbucks didn't exist. And we didn't realize that we needed a $5 cup of coffee to get through the morning. And, to their credit, somebody there, I guess Howard Schultz, somebody recognized there was a market that nobody knew was a market for $5 cups of coffee. And they went out and built a whole business around it. There are equivalents of that in the nonprofit sector that I could point to. I think one locally grown success story is Year Up, where, the whole notion that there was a market for students coming from disadvantaged backgrounds getting entry-level jobs in to help with the talent needs of large corporate employers in IT. That was not something where when Gerald Chertavian and company were getting that off the ground, that was an obvious market need, and yet they saw a need, they built a market, they kind of created the demand. So there are definitely examples of that. But to Amanda's point, I mean, first of all, if you look at Europe's story, that was like a 20-year effort to build what that is. That wasn't something that they did in 2 years. And they certainly didn't start the model assuming that that market was going to be there for them in the beginning. They dealt with the market that they had, and then they built into the market that they were trying to build. So just a few quick conceptual points around this. The first is just to note, our hypothesis, we've talked about this, that typically you're starting with your growth aspiration and trying to meet the universe of need out there. And instead, what we think is that you need to build your revenue goals around the social impact market, the market that is there. What do we mean by a social impact market? What we mean are foundations, large donors, small donors, federal government, state and local government, and consumers. We put consumers in there because many organizations get ticket revenue, they have other kinds of earned revenue enterprises, and so they may be part of that. But all of those different categories are part of what makes up a social impact market. Part of what makes strategy in the nonprofit sector complicated is that we're trying to achieve success on two levels. One is programmatic. Is the thing that we're doing actually delivering programmatically on the promise that we've made to the people we serve? Are we effective with our program? And then the other is financial. Can we do that with a reliable, repeatable source of revenue or sources of revenue to deliver that program over time? And that gets into this concept we talk about, the customer versus the client. Some of you may have heard of a guy named Peter Drucker, who's a guru of strategy from the 1950s forward, who talked about customer-centered strategy. Well, one of the things that makes nonprofit strategy so complicated is that the customer, the entity who pays, is not the same often as the client, the entity who receives. So you get what we call decoupled strategy, which is that you have both a customer strategy and a client-centered strategy, and the two of those combine to give you a nonprofit strategy. And the kind of pro tip here is, ideally, you want what you're promising and delivering to those who pay to be relatively aligned to that you're promising to those who are receiving the service. Where we really see nonprofit strategies start to fall down is when there is a lot of daylight between what it is that you're promising to your customers, the people who are paying, versus what it is that you're promising to your clients, the people who receive. And this gets into this matrix because, of course, we're a consulting firm. So somewhere in here by law, we have to have a 2x2 matrix. It's just included in our every PowerPoint that we do. So in this case, it's on one hand, the value that you're delivering to your client on that vertical axis, and on the horizontal axis, the value that you're delivering to your customer. And, in the lower left corner is the obvious no-go, which is if you're neither delivering value to your client nor your customer, it's game over, right? If you're delivering high value to your client, but limited value to your customer, you have what we would call an unfunded mandate, meaning you have a great program, but nobody that's going to pay for it. And on the other hand, if you're delivering value to your customers, but it's of limited value to your clients, you have what we call mission creep. And I think we can all think of examples of funders kind of pushing nonprofits to start a new type of program without actually considering whether their clients, the people who receive it, actually wanted that thing, whether that was the thing that was top of mind for them versus something else. And obviously the sweet spot, the ideal would be when you're delivering relatively aligned value to both your client and your customer. And that for us is the key, both to understanding nonprofit strategy, but also to understanding sustainability and nonprofit strategy, is trying to align the customer and client values. All right, with that said, I'm going to turn it over to Amanda, and I think we're more or less catching up on time now, if I'm not mistaken, with my quick run through there. So yeah, good.
Steve. All right, so Steve just ran through a whole bunch of the framework for how to think about nonprofit strategy and sustainability. So once everyone has a handle on that, it's time to look at how do we actually get started in building a strategy, especially during uncertain times. So Steve, you can go to the next slide. And before we really dive into what strategy during uncertainty is, it's important to just take a minute to define what it is not. So firstly, it is not emergency. It's not a reaction. It's not crisis management. Certainly that is important in certain cases in a response to an event. So, but, oh, thanks. But when thinking about strategy, creating a strategy is not an emergency response. It's not a one-time response to an immediate need. And it's not reactive, it's not a reaction to a specific event, but in fact, it's preparation for the future, whatever time looks like after that event has occurred. So in the current times, COVID comes to mind as that event, that ongoing event that we're beginning to look at. Okay, so now that the state of the world has at least leveled out for now, we may be in this for a while. It's time to start creating a framework for how we move forward. And it's also not business as usual. It's not the normal, it's not your typical budget or strategic planning process. So that's what it's not. What is it? So strategy during uncertainty is a re-envisioning of reality, in that you're starting to focus on what is coming next, understanding that it's not entirely known what that next or the future might look like, but building a framework to address both the knowns and the unknowns. And it is building somewhat of a new normal, at least for a temporary time period. So how do we start? Like any good type A person, my first piece of advice for you all is to make a list. So what goes into that list? First, identify the decisions that you know that you have to make that are critical to your organization's operations. Identify what you know about what's uncertain, what might be to come, what issues you might be facing in the next 12 to 18 months. And also, to the extent that the unknowns are knowable, identify what you don't know. What questions are coming up that you don't have the answers to yet, but will have to be answered at some point in order to keep moving forward?
And just to interrupt, a good example of that may be something many of you are experiencing right now is uncertainty about what the state budget is going to look like in 2021. We don't know. We know it's probably going to be tough, but we don't know how tough. That's a known unknown right now.
Exactly. Great example. And once you have that list, divide it into those decision points or questions or knowns and unknowns that will need to be addressed in the short term, and those that maybe have a bit of a longer term horizon to need to be addressed. And then as you're thinking through each of the items, think about even if you can't answer them just yet, the conditions that are required to be able to answer those questions, especially those in the short term category, to allow you to start thinking longer term again. And then once you have a bit of a handle on that, developing a timeline for answering some of the questions, identifying and answering the unknowns, and creating some milestones to go along with that timeline in order to ensure that you can keep your organization moving forward, even despite the uncertainty. So just some guiding questions to help you get started. And again, we'll send out the presentation and the recording and all of that. So no need to memorize these questions right now. But when you're thinking about those lists that you've divided into short and long term, when you're thinking about the short terms, So these are specifically around COVID, that they can be focused around any kind of uncertainty or issue that comes up that might make you need to pivot or replan. So thinking about your current organizational model and understanding, to our question at the beginning of the presentation, what pivots are needed, what changes need to be made in order to address, so specifically the COVID-19 outbreak and ongoing pandemic. What parts of your current work need to be or needed to be dialed up to serve the emerging need or the exacerbated need? What's missing from your work that perhaps makes sense for you to take on? And what parts of your work may need to just be taken off the table in the short term to enable you either to focus in on some of these areas that needed to be dialed up or some new areas that are emerging as a need instead. And then once the short term has become, if not routine, at least knowable, in that you know which areas of your work you've dialed up, which areas are on pause, what new areas are beginning to emerge, thinking towards the longer term and thinking about whether anything has actually changed about where you see your organization in 5 years. Has the COVID outbreak, has any other uncertainty created a fundamental change or shift that your organization needs to or would like to take that maybe shifts your overarching strategy for the next 5 years? And then thinking about from where you are now to where you see your organization in 5 years, what needs to happen to move beyond these sort of short-term questions and planning in order to allow you to begin thinking in a longer-term framework. And that could be anything from, to Steve's example, knowing what the state budget is next year, to having a COVID vaccine for all of your clients. So that is our spiel for the morning, and we are going to move into some breakout group discussions for most of the remainder of the time that we have. We will ask you all in your breakouts to designate a reporter and sharer outer, so that when we all come back together as a group, each breakout can take a couple of minutes to share their thinking and some of their thoughts and discussion points that came up. So for the breakout, we're going to ask you to think back to the pivot that you identified at the beginning of the presentation. And for those that may have missed that or maybe forgetting what they had chosen at that time, really thinking about a pivot that you've had to make either programmatically or financially due to COVID or really due to any other uncertainty that your organization has experienced in the past year, a pivot that you had to make or will have to make coming up. And then in the breakout discussions, talk amongst each other to identify how you'll know if this pivot is something that's just around for the short term or if it's a longer term shift. And what are the questions that you'll need to know the answer to plan for the next pivot. So whether that pivot is shifting your organization based on some of the current uncertainty or whether that's shifting back once uncertainty is behind us.
And some of you may have seen that we just put the questions into the chat so that when we send you off into the breakout rooms, if you forget what the questions are, they just pull up the chat window and they're all there for you.
And just another quick note, if anything's unclear, if you have questions while you're in your breakouts, there should be an ask for help button at the bottom of your screen that should allow you to summon Steve to your group if you are in need of assistance. And then just a further reminder, in your breakouts, designate someone to share out your highlights at the end. We'll give each group a minute or two to share your thoughts or ask any questions that came up.
Amanda, are you leading us through the debrief of that? Am I right?
Sure. I don't know exactly how many breakouts there were, though.
Oh, there were 8.
Okay.
Or I'm sorry.
8.
I should say, I think there were 8.
We'll see if anyone volunteers when we get to group 8, we'll know whether there was or not. So I hope you.
There were 6. Sorry.
There were 6. Okay.
Yeah.
Perfect. So I hope you all had great discussions within your groups. I know I was able to pop between a few, and Steve was as well. And It's great to hear you all discussing with one another. And I even heard some potential emerging partnerships coming out of some of the conversations. So that's great too. What we want to do is I hope you each remembered to designate someone to report out for your group. And if not, maybe take 30 seconds to scramble chat between your group members to figure out who might take on that role. But I'll just go in numerical order and kind of request one person from each group to take maybe just a minute or two to kind of share with us some general themes that emerged around how you all are thinking about pivoting and how you'll know whether this is a short or long-term pivot, and any kind of questions that need to be answered before you know whether your pivoting and any other pivots will be short or long-term. I see someone is asking what group we were. So if anyone was in Rudy's group or Michelle's group, it should have said when you went to initially to your breakouts, it should have said which breakout group you were joining, but that probably would have been helpful for us to tell you to keep in mind. So I'll say group numbers, and if no one remembers that group, then I'll just call in someone random to say what group they were in and who was the reporter in their group. But let's see. So it looks like we have group one identified. So group one, whomever your reporter was, do you want to take just 2 minutes to share your themes?
And
sure. So in terms of
great. Go ahead, Rudy. I'm sorry. I wasn't sure whether people actually knew their group number, or their room number. So that's great. Okay.
Somebody in my group told me we were one, so I'm just gonna pretend that that's what we were. In terms of the pivots, I mean, a lot of us obviously had to pivot because most of our program, our operating model relied on face-to-face, whether we were a networking organization that worked on cancer care, an organization that, you know, is working with people with disabilities, school groups, you know, children, youth. So all of us had to pivot in some way. A lot of us did make that transition to virtual. Some of us decided to pause, knowing that you need to invest a lot upfront in order to do it well, and so to think more strategically about, you know, does this make sense for us to do this in the short term, and are we able to do it in a way that is going to capture the same amount of revenue that we would need had we had these things in person. And that, you know, being able to get to that answer quickly, I think was critical in terms of the type of pivot. In terms of whether these pivots are short-term or long-term, I think we all found benefits to technology and figuring out. For some of us, we were able to, there was one example of an annual conference that ended up pivoting to monthly virtual meetings that got great publicity on a local TV network, and the cost savings of not having to produce a big annual conference thus made it possible for this to potentially be a more long-term strategy. Foundations being generous in terms of being able to pivot alongside nonprofits when, you know, things shifted was also pretty critical in terms of whether we were able to continue to do what we were doing in a new format. For some of us, though, the work really will be short term, because there's just too many benefits and needs to have the in-person interaction, and that's so critical to the clients that we serve on a day-to-day basis. So a lot of us are looking for guidance for when that is. Those are the questions that we need to answer. How soon can people travel? How soon can school reopen? How soon can, you know, we get in front of people? Lots of questions around funding, particularly with the state budget, lots of uncertainty there. Also on the federal level, we talked about on a much more macro level, like the $300 charitable deduction under the CARES Act that's expiring at the end of this year, whether that's going to be sustained into next year, and the implications of the 2017 tax code changes. And then also, what are the regulations for federal funding, and also for any private donations? Are they going to continue to be relaxed, understanding the circumstances, or are there still going to be these requirements which will make it even harder to deliver services? Did I miss anything?
That was great. Thank you very much, Rudy.
Thanks, Rudy.
All right. Does anyone from group 2 know that they were in group 2? And are you the designated presenter for group 2?
Hi, Sharon Leader from Group 2. But
Great.
I will invite any other Group 2 person to chime in about points. I think Rudy covered so much. And our basic connection point was we were all mainly client-driven programs. We had 2 different kind of science programs, one a science museum and then a science consortium. We had 2 art-based programs. We had the Cape Verdean community of New Bedford. We also had in Waltham an African immigrant program for teens who are in the US, but whose parents are from Africa. We had the Salvation Army, and I'm sure I'm leaving some people out, but basically we were all concerned with serving our clients. We experienced reduction in funding because of COVID. That was the main pivot point. We all were mainly in-person service deliverers, and many of us transferred into Zoom formats, online formats. And also we found that our communities were very flexible and came together, especially with very high attendance during annual meetings. And what happened with Rudy's group sounds extremely productive with plans for more regular meetings. But we also experienced good attendance at online experiences. We found many advantages to the Zoom format, but also we found that because of funding losses, those people left in the organizations after staff cuts were enforced, became totally overwhelmed and overcommitted. So many people are doing multitasking and are really experiencing much burnout. But we see that we have great flexibility. Our science person offered the fact that there will be more pandemics because of climate change, and that there will be many pivot points that we have to encounter. And so many of us felt that we were going to have to provide for both online and in person going forward, that is the new normal. And we got many ideas from one another. There were several different partnerships developing, and I personally learned that our local college may be able to provide interns for our program. And so many resources were shared, and I thank you. But anyone else from Group 2, please feel free to chime in.
Way to go, Sharon.
Okay.
Thanks, group 2. All right, group 3.
Hi, everyone. I'm speaking for Group 3. Many of us are social service organizations, and about half of us are from the Berkshire area. We, like all of the rest of you, have had to pivot virtually for programming and for fundraising, helping our clients and customers via Zoom, over the phone, all of us trying to up our tech skills to help our staff and our clients and customers. In terms of short-term or long-term, we didn't really know how to define those. We believe that they are short-term pivots in terms of providing everything virtually. We hope to go back, or have gone back to, providing at least up to a hybrid model. What we, the services and for the arts organization, the access to the arts that we provide to our local residents. In terms of financial pivots, many of us have decided to do fundraising virtually over Zoom, or with fundraising on social media. many people commented that for future fundraising would probably move away from holding in-person galas and, you know, the more costly events that so many of us in nonprofits traditionally hold annually. We, in the social service sector, have been providing a lot of emergency funds, much more than we have in the past. And although it's been incredible to see our communities come together in support of those who are the most vulnerable at this time, we have been hitting them up over and over and over again since March, and now are wondering what our annual appeal fundraising will look like. But you know, what comes first is our customers and clients. And then for the future, you know, assuming this will all start to end when there is a COVID vaccine and it's spread widely. But as I'm sure we all know, the financial impact that COVID has had on our economy and our clients and our customers is going to be much more longer lasting than COVID itself, unfortunately.
Wonderful. Thank you, Michelle. Group 4. Oh, Clarissa, I think you're on mute. Yeah.
I'm going to claim group 4 then. I don't know what group we were in. I don't think anyone else knows, so I'm going to claim it. So pretty much we talked about how all of us had to pivot from having bodies inside of our organization and trying to create a way to be able to provide our service. And we've done it virtually as much as we possibly can with the type of service that we provide. We've done it by creating creative solutions. For instance, one of my group members, she has this art gallery, and they had to. I might be butchering it up a little bit, but they had these artists that they provided their art, and they were supposed to have this showcasing, and they weren't able to because of the whole COVID. So they figured out a way how to provide the showcasing by a creative solution. I can't remember exactly how it was done, but and then finding different ways to distribute the monies to still serve the way we serve and our purpose, what our purpose is for. So like, for instance, you know, my purpose, and I believe all of our purpose is to serve at-risk community, and the monies had to go to the at-risk community a different way. So one of my group members, she has a music concert hall, and they're older people, and they're at risk, and they needed, you know, they have they get funded to have these concerts, and the money that was funded to them, instead of having the concerts that they couldn't have anymore, they just gave them the money for their instruments to continue having instruments, so they can have something, because they're at risk and they need the music to help them, if you will. I'm butchering this all up. What else?
You're doing great. You're doing great, Gladys.
Oh, thank you. And let's see, what else do I have? You know, just a disclaimer here, none of us wanted to talk, so I had to. So that's pretty much it. I think pretty much all of us on this Zoom meeting, the Zoom conference video call, I think we're all pretty much in the same boat when it comes to pivoting, creating creative solutions to providing our services to the people that we provide our service to. And that's pretty much in a nutshell. That's it. That's all I have.
Great. Thank you so much. I believe we're at group 5. You know who you are?
I don't know what group I was, and I could have been 4, but can I be 5?
Go for it.
Yeah.
And then whoever hasn't shared yet will share next.
Yeah, Tricia, you're actually group 6, but go ahead. So we'll get to group 5 last.
Okay, thank you. So we were a group of, I'm from the South Coast Community Foundation, and we had myself, and we had an arts-based program, a youth program in our group. And, you know, overall, while the revenue goals remained the same during this year, we've had to hold on fundraising during the spring, especially at the Community Foundation, while focusing on the Emergency Response Fund, because we had opened up a fund to help other nonprofits in our region. And we didn't know where that was going to go. But, you know, we jumped back on the band back in June to make sure that we were going to meet the goals for the year. The other thing that we've had to pivot is in-person events to all virtual programming, just like everyone else. We've had to update technologies in order to do that. And that was really quickly. Online master classes and programming had to pivot outdoor programs, you know, from indoor to outdoor, especially with the youth. Also parent workshops, fund advisors and donors, virtual programming, and actually we have found that there's been an increase in attendance now that it's virtual, as much as people don't really like to use that anymore and can't wait to get back in person. It really has increased the attendance, which is a great thing. So the strategies, looking for other streams of revenue, really important to a few of us. Revisit the strategic plan, you know, now that that's pretty much changed, not really knowing whether it's definitely a long-term issue. Including your board more, and also tapping into alumni, other groups in the area that have not been involved or have learned about our organization. Educating more communications, more in different types of communications through technology, videos, testimonies, that kind of thing to increase fundraising. So that's pretty much sums up what we talked about.
Great. And then the final group that has not yet presented.
I think that's us. We didn't know the
Awesome.
number, so.
No problem.
So the last in line, but we had a mix of participants in our group. You know, we had arts organizations, the Rocky Neck Art Colony, New Bedford Symphony, Creative Outlets Cape Cod, Museum of Arts. We had Child and Family Services from New Bedford, Backyard Growers providing food access on Cape Ann, and then Haverhill Public Television. So it was quite a spread, but we all found that for our pivot, you know, moving online was important for most of us. So whether it was, you know, having an online exhibition or an online class for the arts organizations or an in-home concert, it was also, you know, having for food access, you know, registering people online and reaching out, connecting social workers and you know, connecting people that way. We also, you know, had to do on curbside delivery, get materials to people that way. And, you know, I loved hearing about the Haverhill TV, how they had to, you know, they opened up an educational channel for the schools, you know, really, you know, thinking outside the box. So lots of pivoting in that way. One thing we realized for, you know, the short term and long term is that the online was really beneficial for a lot of us, because especially with the arts organizations helping us reach a broader audience. we can offer more. You know, obviously the learning curve was huge, and is it sustainable that we'll be able to keep doing this? There was backyard growers, Laura mentioned that, you know, the way they're thinking now, it's always in disaster preparedness mode, but that's the normal, and that's, you know, that's not a bad thing. So I thought that was a nice takeaway. It's disaster preparedness without the panic. You know, we're just really thinking about how things could change, and then we can adapt as needed. But a lot of our group members, and please group members, feel free to chime in, but they need to see people in person, you know, so you want to be able to connect, you know, whether it's telehealth or you just want to be able to actually have that one-on-one with somebody. So hopefully it will be more short term. And then for our questions of things we need to know the answer to, you know, a lot of our fund, especially for the arts, our funding sources, they changed their giving. They started, you know, when this happened, maybe all of their funding was going towards COVID, you know, helping healthcare workers. And is this a shift that will stay, or, you know, is this something that will be coming back? You know, will they shift their funding targets when things get normal again, whatever that means? And we're also thinking about our audiences and, you know, when will there be, you know, when will various age groups feel comfortable being together again, if that's, you know, for the symphonies or for, you know, museum programming. You know, we have an older audience that sometimes, you know, we just don't know when that comfort level will be there for being in groups again. And also in re-engaging our volunteers. A lot of our organizations had to let go of volunteers at this time. And so when will that open up again? So I hope I covered everything, but those were some of the takeaways from our conversation.
Thanks so much, Courtney. Thanks for all of you for sharing out and having such great discussions. Before I turn it over to Steve to close us out, are there just one or two any other remaining questions for the group, or anything that you're still wondering that might benefit either from our response or from group response? And I should note that we'll obviously send all the materials out afterwards. We'll send you our emails, and we are also available to have, you know, quick kind of 30-45 minute chats with anyone who may want to. But any questions that still remain?
Awesome room breakout summary by Courtney is what I hear in the chat. Sarah, we agree. We agree that all of the breakout reports were helpful. I think, you know, there's a few things that I'd say in closing on this. We were having our own little mini breakout with Kelton, Jeff Poulos, and I think Madeline from MNM was there for a little bit. And one of the things we were just talking about is just, it goes back to that panic pivot plan moment, which is, I think part of this is emotional and attitudinal. And I'm not by any means a Pollyanna, glasses half full kind of guy. If anything, Amanda will tell you that she's often reminding me not to close on a dark note when I'm doing presentations. But what I will say is, if there were ever a time to embrace strategy, to embrace what it can do for you as a tool in managing anxiety, this is that moment. It really is. And I'm not saying that it's all going to be okay, but I'm saying you have a better chance of navigating your way to the other side of this thing with something intact in terms of your core values, your beliefs, why it is that you're doing what you're trying to do, something intact that you can build back from. That's what you want to do. You know, in another session, not dissimilar from this, that Amanda and I did back in June with a group of grantees of the Greater Worcester Community Foundation, one of the things I talked about was, you know, back in 2008, I was a CEO of a nonprofit that I had taken over 6 months earlier, and I discovered that the the fundamentals, the financial fundamentals of the organization were already pretty troublesome to us. And in November of that year, 2008, the stock market, as many of you will recall, crashed. Our biggest funder, who was responsible for more than 50% of our annual budget, going back to that concentration of risk thing that we talked about, he took the Amtrak up from New York to tell me that they were cutting us out the following year because they'd lost more than half the value of their endowment. And the next week, I got diagnosed with what was supposedly a fatal form of cancer, but I'm still here to tell you that story 12 years later. And the reason I bring that up is to simply say, part of what got me through the next year and a half, 2 years, was understanding strategy, understanding the parts of the organization that were important, allowing us to grieve for the things we had to let go of, like me letting go of my hair. There were things like that that we had to do. But the fact of the matter was, we were still there on the other side of it. The things that were important that had brought us together to start the organization in the first place were still there. We had to shut 12 of the 23 sites that we were operating in this youth organization. So there was a lot that sucked, and I don't want to pretend that it didn't, but I want to tell you that the ability to have that kind of clarity on what do we stand for, what's the core that we're going to try to hold on to and build back from on the other side of it, that's what kept us going through this. I want to thank you all today. I want to wish you grace and strength as we navigate the continued uncertainty of this moment. And as Amanda said, if we can be helpful to you, we're happy to chat with you offline or send you materials, all that sort of stuff. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Steve. I'm just going to pop in quickly to say thank you again to the team from Impact Catalysts for presenting today and sharing their expertise. Thank you to all of you for your thoughtful work in the breakouts. I shared once again the upcoming programs as part of the Massachusetts Community Foundation Partnership. So I definitely encourage you to explore those. And if you want to spend some more time with the team from Impact Catalysts, they are actually presenting as part of the Nonprofit Learning Institute, which is a free capacity building opportunity that Philanthropy Massachusetts and Bank of America present to the sector, the Massachusetts nonprofit sector. Applications for that program are currently open, and I can share a link to learn some more information. And if you have any questions about the partnership, MPLI, or something else going on in the nonprofit sector, please feel free to reach out to me or Madeline, who's also here from MNN, can also be a resource. So thank you again and have a good rest of your day.
Thanks,
Thanks, everyone.
I know.
Thank you.